Hi, my name is Elizabeth Dulemba, and I am honored to be here celebrating the 50th anniversary of SCBWI. Happy birthday, SCBWI. You've meant a ton to my career and my life, and I am so appreciative and honored to be part of the scheduling for this summer. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to direct the viewer's eye. Now, as illustrators, we have a lot of tools in our toolbox to actually control the viewer's experience, more so than you may think. So I'm going to show you a few things of how you can do this through using tools like light, color and saturation, contrast, framing and staging, shape, timing, and composition. So we'll start with light. Now obviously there is the default, the obvious, the spotlight. Nothing draws your eye like a light shining on something saying you're supposed to be looking at this, like in the artwork for The One and Only Ivan by Patricia Castillo. So another thing is using it in a manipulative fashion where you're trying to invoke a particular mood. So Molly Idle does this on the cover of Zombolina because we've got this big thing above us called the sun. Well, most of the light that we're used to working with is above us. So when the light is below us or coming from a direction we don't expect, it creates an eerie kind of sense and spookiness. So it works really well here. Light can also have temperature. So here in Fritz Baumgarten's piece, we've got this little gnome guy lighting a candle. Well, it's a warm light source. So it's got yellows and oranges, very high contrast, very warm. Our eye is going right to that little lantern right in the middle of the piece. But we've got two light sources here, which is really interesting because in the background, we also have the moon and the stars creating a cool light source in the background. In fact, I challenge you illustrators to create some pieces that actually have a warm and a cool light source in them. To just kind of, exercise your illustrator chops. I'm going to actually have that in my handout for you to do as well. So how do you intentionally use light in your work? Well, one of the ways I've done it is in my storyboard stage, I'm actually acting like a stage director. So if you look at the storyboard for Paco and the Giant Chili Plant, you can see all these little lines pointing down, kind of like little chopsticks. What they are is light direction. I'm literally saying, this is my spotlight, this is where the light's going to be shining. Now, the only default with that is that it's not taking into account that I'm trying to relay a three-dimensional space in a two-dimensional surface. So whereas the light is going from left to right, it might also be going forward or back. So I need to be keeping that in mind as I'm doing the artwork. The other thing I want you to be looking at here too is the swishes. Now at Hollins University, where I teach picture book design, I'm kind of famous for my swishes. Now what these are is it's a division of positive negative space. It's also reminding me to keep room for the type. You'd be surprised how many illustrators forget to do that. But it's also creating a sense of momentum and motion because as an illustrator, your job is to make somebody want to turn the page. Now, somebody who did this really well is Marla Frazee. Her thumbnails for Roller Coaster are online. And I mean, look at the swishes going on here. It almost makes me want to see the whole book unfolded instead of from by page by page. Fantastic motion, makes you want to turn the page. So I have come up with a slightly more evolved way to deal with the light issue. So in Crow Not Crow, one of my more recent books with Jane Yolen and Adam Stempel, I actually created a stage of thumbnails. Now this is after I've done the drawings. I shrink them back down, I create a new thumbnail page, and I'm using that for color scripting and for this to figure out where the light's coming from. So as a watercolor artist, oftentimes I'll deal with one color as my first layer down. So this one was yellow, was my first color all the way through. Did all the art, it was all yellow. But I was also showing where my light direction was going to be coming from. So you can see here, I've got lighter areas, paler areas of yellow. That's my light directions showing in my pieces. Now here's what it looks like up close. This is really small, so it's really kind of blurry, but you can kind of see the light is inside the piece, far, far away, but it's making the shadows cast forward towards us. And this is what it ended up looking like in the final piece, and indeed the shadows are coming towards us. Another tool in your toolbox is color and saturation. Now Dennis Nolan uses this to really good effect by using complementary colors. Those are the colors that are on the opposite sides of a color wheel. A lot of football teams will be complementary colors. So here he's got red and green, and the most saturated color in this entire piece is those red pajamas on the little boy. So guess where your eye is going? I'm betting it went to that little boy first. So here's a piece by John Hendricks in A Boy Called Dickens. He uses this really well because the entire piece is actually sepia except for Charles Dickens himself, who is the only fully rendered person in this entire layout. Now he's also pulling another trick here. That window that he's against is basically creating a halo around his head or framing him. So that's another kicker that's kind of making us look at him before we look at anything else. And you'll see that in another piece that I'm going to show you. So why does this work? I call it my fruit salad theory. All right, so you look at a beautiful bowl of luscious fruit and all the colors are kind of the same richness, the same value. You don't know what to eat first, right? It's kind of like a focal point. So I went in and I changed everything to a lower contrast, lower saturation, except for one strawberry. Now where does your eye go? I bet it went to that one strawberry. That's because that's now a focal point. It's actually drawing your eye. If you're in a portfolio review and you're getting the feedback that your work looks flat, this is how you solve that, okay? So one of the reasons that this fruit salad theory works is because it's creating contrast. Now contrast works because light on dark makes light pop and dark on light makes dark pop. So here we've got a piece by Bill Mayer where that white sail is popping against that big black ship. It's also doing that framing effect that Jimi Hendrix did. So all of that is making us look at that little sailboat. Also the shape dynamic because it's so vulnerable in comparison to that big ship. So the shape dynamic is also drawing our viewpoint. Now James Gurney did a really interesting job with this contrast and this theory that I'm talking about in Dinotopia. If you look at this dinosaur that's right in the middle of the image, he's got two tricks going on. So first of all, the head of that dinosaur is very light against a very dark background. In fact, that dark background is so big, it's kind of creating that window that Jim Hendrix created. It's creating that big black ship side that Bill's piece did, and it's making that head pop. But if you follow that dinosaur all the way down to his body, you can see now we've got the opposite going on. His body is dark on light, which is still making the body pop forward. But all of this is creating this sense of depth. And depth is what we need to create an illusion of three-dimensionality. If we don't have it, everything appears flat. All right, so this all works because our eye, and this is all very scientific, we've got rods and cones in there that are always trying to figure out what's close to us, what's far away. You know, is that predator close enough that I need to start running, or is it far away and I don't need to worry about it, right? So there's more to be read about that, but I don't have time to go into it in these 15 minutes that I have. So what happens without contrast? So you've probably seen this when colors are next to each other and they start vibrating. Colors have value, just like white to black has value. Colors have value too. So like a lighter value of red is not pink, it's actually a lighter red. But when they're next to each other and they have the same value, they start fighting for your attention, for those rods and cones in your eye, as your eye is trying to figure out what's in front, what's behind. So they vibrate. And just to prove this, that these are the same value, I took away the color and just left with the value. And you can see it just grayed out the whole thing. So if your artwork is appearing flat, if that's what you're hearing, this is why. So you need to be creating things that are pushing forward and back in the picture plane. All right, now how do you do that? So if you are thinking about your artwork like a stage manager, all right? So if we look at this piece by Amy Bennett, she created this beautiful stage and we've got several layers in it. So this is called depth of field, okay? So we've got some curtains on the outside. That's our first layer. That's inviting us in. These trees that are in the front are kind of in silhouette, again, inviting us in. It's kind of like peeking into around a door or whatever. We're a bit voyeuristic. We like to be seeing what's around the corner where the lit part is. The performers and the light are not at the front. They're inside this composition. They're about the third layer in. Now the trees behind them are still kind of high contrast, but you can see as it goes back towards the back of the stage, it gets lighter and less contrasty. So that's called atmospheric perspective. When things go through the atmosphere farther and farther away from us, they tend to get less contrasted and they turn a little bit blue. So if you do that, you're going to start creating a sense of depth. Maurice Sendak did this. Here's a piece with Max, and you can see if you apply what we just learned with Amy Bennett to this, you get this depth of field. And that sky is the back of the stage, basically. And Maurice was a stage designer, and you can see that influence right here. Our own beloved Tommy DePaolo was really good at using limited depth of field to great advantage. So if you look at the covers of some of his books, he's always framing them with basically the curtains or some kind of border. And if you look at Big Anthony, I mean, he is right there leaning into that with us. He is, one layer. right there with us in our face. Now you've got the field, that might be layer 2, the little house behind that, layer 3, and then the sky, which it doesn't give us a whole lot of information there. So that's only 4 layers. That's really not much. But when you break it down like that, you can see how that depth of field is, purposefully creating things that you're supposed to be looking at first. Now, to give you a better example of this, this is a piece by Chris Dunn from The Wind in the Willows. And you can see this happening here too. This might be an intimidating piece if you're an illustrator thinking, I could never do this. Well, you can if you start breaking it down and simplifying it into these ideas. So this is really only about 4 layers. You've got the rat and the otter in the front that are kind of silhouetted, again, inviting us in. The focus point is the second layer, which is the light shining down and reflecting off of the white ruff of the fox and the otter. And somebody's obviously cheating. We're supposed to be looking at this table, right? The fox and the badger, who are in the next layer, they're not as saturated, they're not as high contrast if you really look at it. And then that wall, even though it's got all that detail, there's not a lot of saturation going on. The value range is very limited. It's just not pulling our eye in because it's not as punchy as what's in the foreground. Just to prove it, I went in and I broke this into layers so that you could see it at work. So you've got that silhouette layer, the lit layer, which is our focal point, and then the layers that go back from it. So another tool is shape and shape placement. Now, I'm just going to point you to a really good resource here. So this is a book called Picture This, How Pictures Work by Molly Bang. I use this all the time in my classes when I teach picture book design at Hollins University. And it's talking about how where we put things on the page really determines how we respond to them. So that little triangle there, that's Little Red Riding Hood. Now, she may not look like much. You might be like, yeah, that's not Little Red. Well, let me show you this. You can see how Little Red is now the cover of Beth Ann Woolven's book, and also Wolf in the Snow. Matthew Cordell was an actual alum from Winthrop University, and it's just a little red triangle right there. So in both cases. All right, now a lot of times the shapes work because they're in relation to other shapes. If you ever noticed, a group of 10 to 14-year-olds, they can look really grown up until you put them around their parents, and suddenly you see how old they are. So by creating these dynamics of shapes and how they react to each other, you can get a sense of focal point. So I'm just going to let you go into that book and enjoy it because there's tons to learn in there. But let's also talk about timing. So finding the exact moment to illustrate is a huge part of focusing your reader's attention. So we're going to look at The Wizard of Oz, and I want you to figure out which moment do you think is where you would have the most invested, which is the highest tension moment, the most emotion going on. So is it when Pa warns about the tornado? Or is it when Dorothy actually sees the tornado? Or is it when the house is actually caught up in the tornado? Now you need to pause here to come up with the answer because I'm going to give you the answer. All right, it's not this one. A lot of people think it's this one. It's not this one. If COVID proved us anything, it's that we are incredibly adaptive creatures. We adapt to our new realities really quickly. So even though her house has been caught up in a tornado, this is her new reality. She knows it's happening and she's ready to deal with it, right? It's this one. Because in this one, she sees the imminent danger. She knows it's coming. She doesn't know what's going to happen yet. She doesn't know how this is going to turn out. That's really disturbing. That's the moment of tension. That's the right one to illustrate. All right, so composition, another tool in your toolbox. I'm going to talk to you about the golden spiral based on the golden ratio. This is a mathematical equation that has been around for hundreds, thousands of years. It was invented in India. It was rediscovered in Italy. And it is numbers that as they increase, they create this spiral that we see in nature. Now there's lots of different ratios, mathematical things that repeat in nature, but this one's especially relevant and kind of cool, and people like talking about it a lot. So we're going to talk about this. All right, so the ratio is 1.618. And what it is basically is that this rectangle is the same ratio as this rectangle, same ratio as this rectangle, and so on. So when you have those rectangles going in sequence, what you end up with is an actual spiral like what I just showed you. All right, so the other thing about this is when you get this, you can start seeing how it might allude towards the rule of thirds. All right, so if you take this equation and you flip it, and you flip it again, and you flip it again, suddenly you've basically divided your page into thirds on the top, and from the top down and from the left to the right. So that's creating 4 intersection points. Now these are called focal points. there's a reason why your art teacher is always telling you to use your focal points, you know, or use the rule of thirds. It's not just because they're trying to make this stuff up. It's scientific. It's based on the golden ratio. This is going into nature in everything that we do. We see it in the nautilus shell. We see it in the ram's horn. We see it in the fiddlehead of a fern. We're talking DNA level stuff here, right? So good design is not just a fluey, you know, kind of weird thing. It's based on some real science and on our own being. All right, so how does this apply? All right, I've given you a worksheet. This is what it looks like. Now, the first image, you're going to work with coming up with lighting and changing that up a little bit, remembering going forward and back. Second piece is to challenge you to use a warm light source and a cool light source. So the lamp, obviously, use that as a warm light source, and then come up with a cool light source coming from somewhere else, like through a window or something. And at the bottom, I've got 3 images that I want you to take your finger or pencil or whatever and kind of see if you can map out how the golden spiral maps onto those and directs your eye and makes you look at what the illustrator wants you to look at. So if you need to pause, because I'm about to show you the answers, all right? So here is the answer for Dennis Nolan's Sea of Dreams. You can see that it's taking you right to that ship, and the people who are on that ship, that's what you're supposed to be paying attention to. In Jim Madsen's Pirate, we go right to his face. Now, it might also be because he's looking at us and we're always like, yeah, is it friend or foe? Do I need to be worried? Do I need to run? That kind of thing. But this is how the spiral lays out on that. And finally, Chris Buzzelli, you can see, again, a lot of times it does go to a face, you know, that it's drawing our attention right there. So it's not just the eye and the face, but it's also the shape of the composition that's pulling us in. So all that said, I hope you have fun with my activity sheet. I hope you've learned a few tips from this. I kind of sped through a lot of information, but I hope it really helps you out and makes you a better illustrator. Do please subscribe to my newsletter. And again, happy birthday to SCBWI. I look forward to another 50 years. Thanks so much for your time.